Um, oh, Colin, we've known each other for nearly 3 decades now, and we've worked together and we've become friends. And during that time, I've learned that as a practitioner, as a teacher, as a researcher, you've been involved in health and social care for many decades. And when we talk about research, we often talk about how talking with students, perhaps that the need to be able to compare. So if you're going to study something, you've got to measure something, and you're measuring it. So what do we compare that with? And as members of a research centre called Learning from the Lived Experience, I think that's something that you can bring, well, not uniquely, but with a very strong personal flavour to it, because you can bring a narrative which compares before and after the beginnings of the NHS, and I think that's a story that's really worth sharing, really worth telling. So I'm gonna ask you if you'd be good enough to do that here today, please.
Yeah, well, in one sense, perhaps we have to start with the baseline of birth. I was born in 1936, before the Second World War, and of course I was born into an ordinary working class family, and in those days officially 90% of the general population were, quote, working class. And of course this was a very different world. Now, one of the real advantages, as you say, one can look back. I'm going to be terribly inverse ageist. Very often I feel that younger people are too young to understand. And I look at the world, and for example, let's talk about a current recent event. Most of our students belong to the digital world. Now, when I was a professor at Southampton University in 1986, I was boasting I'd got an electronic typewriter. When the floppy disk came out in 96, I was saying it's marvellous. They take 4 or 5 essays. When I was a young lecturer in 1970 at the School of Medicine in Leeds University had the largest non-MOD computer in the British Isles, and it was housed in a building almost the size of an aeroplane hangar, and it had 3 megabytes and so forth. And when I was a postgraduate student, I admit I was a kind of prize one, and I was given the key to a little room which had a memory, a calculator, the 2 memory freezing calculator, and I could do calculations by hand with 2 memories, which meant was incredible. So, but that's recent. That's recent. And of course, as you know, I know, we're looking at some of the impact of the changing environment to human health, but we'll talk about the past.
Yeah.
So trying to highlight just how different a world it is. We have, in 1936, in 1945, people like us did not have television. For example, my stepmother was a bit crazy, and she almost mortgaged the house to buy a television, which is then £200, which was a quarter of the price of the house. And we saw the Queen's coronation flickering in vague black and white ghost figures in 1953. And I was already a young man. When I look back, perhaps the best way of looking at how the world was thinking of my school days. The war was normal for us. But what we didn't know, and this is what you learn about life when you get older, you can look back and reflect. I didn't realize that my group of kids going through the war, because of rationing, we were the first working class children to have vitamin C throughout the whole of the year. Because until rationing came, we had cod liver oil, and orange juice and powdered eggs. We didn't realize what a rich diet that was. So almost without exception, most of the lads in my class, when we were 14 and 15, were taller than our parents. And you can't imagine the kind of diet on rationing we had during the war. I'm not joking. A family's meat ration, you and I would eat it in one dinner together with Hayley and Sam Porter and Karen and everything else. You know, quite literally. People don't believe it, but it's true. You had 2 rashers of bacon, and I won't go on. But the other side, and of course, we just had VE Day and VJ Day, and I remember them both. And I'm not sure I should tell you, you do realise that I'm a theft and an arsonist.
Yes, I do actually, but yeah. You've started the confession now, so you'll have to go through.
Well, I finished. It was VE Day, Victory in Europe, in May 1945. And suddenly everything had changed. The war was over. And now all the neighbours, because everybody knew everybody, we must have a bonfire. So the men said to you lads, go around and find some wood. So I said to Eric Barstow, I said, hey, Eric, I know where there's some railway sleepers. And it's Mr. Jeffries on the other side of the railway line. So me and Eric went through, pushed our way through the fence, climbed over the railway lines, got hold of these 2 big, well, 1 big railway sleeper, and carted them over the railway line. Of course, it's all illegal. And suddenly, as we got through the hedge, Mr. Bairstow sees us, Mr. Jeffries sees us, hey, you little buggers, etc. And he's chasing us. So there's me and Eric with this railway sleeper on our shoulders, running like mad to the bonfire. And Mr. Jeffries is about perhaps 15 yards behind us, almost out of puff, shouting his head off, you little buggers, I'll tell you, Dad, I'll tell Bobby Smith, etc. And we threw the railway sleeper at the front of the men. And the men said, hey, lads, you've done really well. And Mr. Jeffries came up and he paused, tried to get some breath and said, oh, there'll only be one VE Day. Come on, lad, you can have 2nd one. So I was a theft and an arsonist. But more seriously, what was the world like? In 1944, I was in Temple Street Primary School, all lads. There were 500 of us, and literally there were 50 kids in the classroom. We only had 1 male teacher because all the men were doing other things, etc. We used to bathe at least once a week, whether or not we needed it. And on Friday nights, there would be known as a boom boom sound, as you'd be taking the tin bath, which was stuck on a peg outside, and you put it in front of the kitchen fire, and they'd fill it with hot water, and the youngest child would get in the bath first, then the second, etc. So I was very lucky. I only had 1 brother, so I got into the bath water second. And when we'd had our bath, we'd get out and stand in our mucky shirt. I now realise that our classrooms must have stank. On the other hand, the other side of things, again, I didn't understand what it meant. But on Friday afternoons, Mrs. Rayner, never forgotten her, because she used to have a ruler. And I can see it, yeah. I can show you what she did. If she didn't like you, she'd get this ruler and flap you. I'll flick thee, I'll slap thee, she said, and hit you with the side of a ruler. It wasn't very pleasant. And then she'd say to Dennis Braithwaite and I, we were the 2 so-called bright lads, right, Colin Pritchard, Dennis Braithwaite, you take 5 dummies each and go into the corner of the classroom and teach them. That 5 dummies were children who were learning disability, Down syndrome, elephantitis, asthmatic, cerebral palsy, etc. We knew them as dummies because there was no resources for them. And we're being nice to them because they were our dummies. Nobody else was allowed to thump them. We might thump them, but nobody else was allowed to thump them because there was no service. It wouldn't be too far-fetched to say that a child died in my school virtually every month. It was seen as sad, but it happened. My own brother nearly died, quite literally 2 or 3 times. And one of the things about my generation, one of the reasons why we might not be repeated, because we've, here we are in our 80s. See, we survived before antibiotics.
Yeah.
You had to be pretty tough. I nearly died with a series of boils. it could have almost developed into septicemia. And kids did die of septicemia from getting infection from boils. That's a kind of, you'd get a scratch, you'd get infected, and it would get huge pus, and it'd be almost the size of your fist and everything else. And this was normal.
Yeah.
The Labour government came in, and what was remarkable, again, we didn't know it because our norm. We didn't know we were poor because everybody else around us was poor.
Yeah.
But there was a difference. And even I knew as a child, there was two kinds of working class. What Professor Jones, the late Professor Jones from Cardiff University, aptly described as respectable working class, which was families like ours, but we went to Methodist Church, and non-respectable. And that was okay, they're dead now, the Varley family. Mm-hmm. Now, I didn't understand what was happening with the Varley family, but there'd be a crisis in the family. And Malcolm and I, because we all shared a bed, kids didn't have a bed on their own in those days. And the three Varley brothers would come, and there'd be fivers in a bed, top and tail. And the sisters would go to another neighbour. One of the things I remember about neighbours and my mother, we were a pretty good family that way. We helped people out. Mam would come home smelling of nettle. It was rather nice nettle smell. She'd been helping to deliver a baby. Frankly, you only call the midwife if there were problems. Mm. The other side, she'd come out smelling of Lysol, where she'd been helping to lay out a neighbour who died. When the war was over, there was the great Beveridge report, Sir Simon Beveridge, a liberal, who talked about the five giants. I'm sure, Richard, you must have mentioned, you know, sloth, idleness, disease, ignorance, and so on. And of course, I'm a generation who really was able to benefit for access to education. And my grandson gets cross with me and said, when I say to him, I owe everything to education. Oh, don't go on, Grandad. But I do, you know, bearing in mind, as you know, I left school at 15 with all the problems things. But the health service was quite wonderful. Going back to my brother who nearly died, and this gets a bit personal. He was on death's door, quite literally. Yeah, I now understand, looking back, he could hardly breathe. And we had a very unusual female GP. And I didn't know at the time, she had a friend of hers who'd been at medical school with her at the Pontefract Military Hospital. Mm-hmm. And she went over and said, look, I've got this child dying in this very respectable family. And you've got this new thing called sulfonamides. That was actually before antibiotics, but it's a form of antibiotics. Malcolm was given it, and literally the next day he was running around. It was miraculous. Mm. And I remember later on when one got illnesses, like, for example, still got boils, you have a dose of antibiotics and they disappeared. It was truly miraculous. The problem with the Malcolm's sulfonamides, this would be in about 1945. Mm-hmm. We were paying for those sulfonamides, believe it or not, till 1950. Gosh. The one I really think, of course, is my mother. And the great founder of the National Health Service was this wonderful Welshman, Aneurin Bevan. And my father-in-law, my late father-in-law's great moment of triumph, because he was a Welshman, a Welsh miner like Nye Bevan was, when Nye Bevan and a group of left-wing socialists took over the Tregedigau workhouse to highlight the conditions in the workhouses where you put people who were still alive but destitute and everything else. You've seen Oliver Twist. Frankly, it's a romanticised. People would become infirm, so they'd go to the workhouse. And the workhouse was deliberately designed to make life uncomfortable. You'd have the very rare working class family who got to 70. And he'd be a miner and his lungs are shot. She's had TB and her lungs are shot. They're about to die, so they put him in the workhouse. And what they would do, they would be separate. They would separate men and women who've been married for 30, 40, 50 years, and they'd separate them. That was the workhouse. And of course, we had the welfare state to get rid of the workhouse. But the NHS, Nye Bevan, had this wonderful learning from experience. He called it in place of fear. What he said was, so often working class women, because they fear the bills, get illness which were preventable or curable, hang on, don't go, and die. We still get this today. Frankly, we still have a disproportionate number of working class people who die of cancer because they were so frightened, didn't have the language to talk to a middle class person like a medical doctor, you know, particularly with what they call women's problems, you know, cervix, uterine cancer and everything like that. Working class women felt embarrassed by it, so they don't go and see the doctor too late and they die, even in the 21st century. But the worst thing was, my mother hurt a toe and she went to the doctor. Now, we were lucky. My dad was he was a socialist, and he paid 6p a week for my mum and himself, and 3p each for Malcolm and I, my brother, to be on the doctor's panel, which meant that when we wanted to go to the doctors, we only paid half fees for the consultation, which was then 7 and 6, and half the medicines.
So you say 7 and 6. I'm going to interrupt this to put it into context. So how much of that was the equivalent? I mean, what was the
My
wage?
dad's wage, he was a foreman. My dad's wage was £2.10.
Okay.
So that would have been 7 and 6. Put it this way, if you're earning £2, that would be a sixth of a man's wage.
Okay, fine.
More than the rent.
Yeah.
More than the rent. So my mother went to the doctors and said, oh, well, look, you know, you've got a very nasty infection there. Look, what you want to do is clean it with antiseptics and use Sloan liniment. And it'll only cost you 1 and 3. That's 7p. Whereas otherwise, half the, you know, it'll be 3 and 6 for my consultation. But to be fair to her, she said, if it gets worse, come back. So Mum did her best and got Sloan's liniment. And she began to not be so well. My dad said, well, how's it for? Oh, she denied it, etc., etc. Then she became ill. I could see she was ill. I didn't understand it. And I remember she hugged me just before I went off to school. And she smelt slightly differently, rather sweet. Bear this in mind, what you'll hear in a moment. I went off to school. When I came home, my mum had gone to hospital. 3 days later, my mother, aged 33, had died. She'd got gangrene in her foot. That had turned to septicemia and triggered off diabetes. And what I could smell was the diabetic problems. And she died. Oddly enough, there's an old saying, if you want to learn, teach. I remember once talking to a group of students about this, and they said, well, why did your mother die so young? And one of the things that struck me, that if my mother had lived when my wife and I got married, my mother would have only been 58. My mother died at 33. Why? Because she was very typical of most working class women, particularly during the war. You had to feed the man first. If the man didn't work, the family were in trouble. So the man got fed. Then the mother fed the children. Then herself last. And that was very typical. When my mother died, Dr. Pagnell said, I won't charge you. In the circumstances, I won't charge you for the medicine or the hospitalization. But we had to pay the sulfonamides for a further 3 years. That was what the world was like before the NHS. And of course, when the NHS came in, I don't want to be political, but must give genuinely objective data. The Conservative parties opposed it. They said it would be kind of neo-fascist, authoritarian. And how has the world treated, and how has Britain treated our NHS? You know, here we are at the end, well, in the middle of COVID, and we're all clapping for the NHS, etc. Richard, let me give you some facts based on World Bank evidence. From 1980 to 2016, which is the latest figures we've got, how do you measure how much we give to the NHS? Pounds and billions, it doesn't mean anything. You have to have a comparison. Yeah. So what we do have is gross domestic product, the national wealth. How much of our national wealth do we give to our NHS? The fact is, since 1980 to 2016, if you take the average of those years, we are bottom of the league table.
And the league table includes which?
21 Western countries. The top of the league table is United States of America. Over that 34 years, sorry, I can't, yes, that's right, 36 years, America's average of its national wealth was 13.2% of its GDP. Ours is 7.1%. And if you look over the years, because some, you know, different governments, different regimes give more to the NHS, some give less. If we look from 1980 to 2016 and look at the years when our GDP expenditure on health went up and, well, went down from previous year, it went down 3 times under Margaret Thatcher. She wanted to reduce public expenditure. It went down twice under the nice Mr. Major, went down once under Mr. Cameron, and down under, sorry, twice under Mr. Cameron. Now, to be fair, we're now only 15th lowest or highest out of the 21 Western countries. Margaret Thatcher, let me totally agree with Margaret Thatcher. You can only have the services you can afford. But Richard, we just don't afford as much as Greece and Portugal. And how does this show itself? Now, you and I know we've done some research. The good news is we do far better than America. Indeed, you know, our new paper coming out in International Journal of Health Services, it's coming out next month, we show that if America matched the NHS death rate, there'd be 400,000 fewer dead Americans. So the American system, as you know, the highest adult death rate in the Western world is America. The highest child mortality rate is in America. But Richard, we can't start boasting about child mortality. We've got the 3rd worst relative poverty in the Western world. The gap between the top 10% and the bottom 10% is 13 times, 17 times in America. But we're the 3rd worst unequal society in the Western world. And Richard, we are the 5th highest child mortality. See, children don't have votes. Our NHS, we're doing extremely well for people in your age group and my age group and the general adults. We've improved, of course, deaths are down, but not as much as they could be. Because frankly, we can only have the service as we can afford, but we don't afford as much as other people.
Okay, thank you.
That about right?